Hi, good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Hui Ting and I'm the moderator for today's panel discussion titled The Climate Crisis, Why Green Capitalism Cannot Save Us. So Socialism 2021 is jointly organized by Parti Socialist Malaysia, Socialist Workers Thailand, Partido Lakas ng Masa Philippines, Socialist Alliance Australia, Partai Rakyat Pekerja, and Kesatuan Perjuangan Rakyat from Indonesia. Before we start, I would like to go through some rules. So all participants are requested to respect differences in views and opinions. Q&A is not for debates, but for asking questions only. Please pose questions in a short and specific manner to the respective panel. We will not tolerate any derogatory remarks, sexist or vulgar postings in the chat. The organizers have a right to remove such participants if they are found to do so. And for the panelists, please speak slower for the interpreters to do their translations more smoothly. Now, I would like to welcome and introduce our panelists. So introducing our first speaker, Lidi Nagpil of Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. Lidi is the chairperson of multi-sectoral organization San Lakas, coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, coordinator of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, member of the Coordinating Committee of the Global Alliance on Tax Justice. She also serves as the Vice President of the Freedom from Debt Coalition and also a candidate for the Partido Lakas ng Masa Party in the May 2022 elections. Welcome, Lidi. Our second panelist is Sarah Hathaway from Geelong, Victoria, Australia. So Sarah is a trade union organizer in the health sector and the national co-convener of the Socialist Alliance Australia. She has been involved in organizing young people, human rights and environmental campaigns in Geelong. Welcome, Sarah. Our third panelist is Melisa Kawara, National Coordinator of Extinction Rebellion Indonesia. Melisa is a wooden toy maker turned climate activist. Since 2019, Melisa has been actively involved in Extinction Rebellion Indonesia and Jeddah Iklim, a coalition of civil society organizations that seek to pressure the government towards real climate action, including establishing a citizens' assembly as a system change. She joined Partai Hijau Indonesia in 2021 with a single goal to change the economical and political system of Indonesia. Welcome, Melisa. So as we all know, the climate crisis is no longer a looming threat as people around the world have begun to experience its devastating effects. We've seen forest fires, major floods, and extreme weather conditions happening. Even the pandemic itself is also linked to environmental destruction. The climate crisis is a problem that threatens the very existence of humanity. Yet, after numerous global climate negotiations, corporate net zero pledges, and green consumerism, using terms like sustainability and going green, these initiatives are often not enough to solve the issue, and in some cases, making it worse. So with our lives and future at stake, do we want to leave the Earth's future into the hands of corporations and politicians whose interests are aligned to protect the capitalist status quo? So first and foremost, I would like to welcome Comrade Lidi to give her opinions on this issue. The floor is yours, Lidi. Hi, Lidi, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry, I thought I did.
Okay.
Good afternoon to everyone. I'm speaking from Quezon City, from the Philippines. We all know that the root of global warming and the climate crisis is capitalism. Capitalism involves the extraction, production, and use of fossil fuels in a continuous, indiscriminate, and fast expansion of extraction of natural resources, of overproduction, of opening up and competing for new markets, and the push for new non-essential products, all for the relentless pursuit of profits. This core logic of capitalism gave rise to the excessive geometrically increasing and historical and continuing greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So we can't just talk about fossil fuels. We have to talk about the core logic of capitalism itself combined with this excessive use of fossil fuel energy. Capitalism is also responsible for many industries, including agro-industrial estates that generate other greenhouse gases not from fossil fuels, but from extraction and production methods and technologies. In addition, the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has been severely aggravated by the massive pollution and destruction of natural carbon sinks like land, forests, oceans, and other bodies of water, leading, of course, to even a net greater concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So the question is, can capitalism or green capitalism, can we achieve that? Can capitalism be transformed enough not only to stop climate catastrophe, but also to empower people and communities to deal with many of the already irreversible and continuing impacts of climate change, exercise their rights, fulfill all basic needs, and live equitably, safely, and with meaning? The answer, of course, is obviously no. The world is now 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-capitalist industrialization levels. And the warming rate is faster than what was earlier projected. This was confirmed by the latest Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, when they released the report in August of this year. We have also seen and experienced the increasingly very destructive impacts of the climate crisis in the last decade, and the worst will surely come no matter what we do, because the seeds of more intensive impacts are already there. The world has thus far failed in significantly slowing down the speed of increase. It's not even slowing down the actual greenhouse gas emissions, but the speed of increase of greenhouse gas emissions, let alone reaching peak and achieving sustained reduction and downward trend. To keep global temperature rise at the safest level still possible, which is, according to the scientists, below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the world must fully decarbonize or reach zero emissions by mid-century. That is about 29 years from now. And some people might say, that's still a long time, right? The important thing to remember is that what the world does in the next 10 years in terms of actual emissions reductions will determine whether that 1.5 degree ceiling will still be possible. So we may have the 29 years to reach full decarbonization, but what will happen in the next 10 years will determine if that will still be possible. On the surface, there seems to be wide consensus among governments, institutions, and companies even, many companies, to aim for keeping temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees. This goal is reflected in the Paris Agreement, which most governments have ratified, and public institutions and private companies have been pledging left and right that they will be aligning their investments, financing, and operations with the Paris Agreement. In reality, the climate pledges and targets, the economic, financial, energy, and other policies and programs, the actual behavior and practice of all governments without exception, I must say, and of public institutions and private corporations show clear failure in meeting the full requirements to achieving this goal, and not even the goal of keeping it below 2 degrees. No? So the goal of keeping it below 1.5 degrees, they're definitely not going to meet that given their current policies, targets, practices, and behavior, and not even keeping it to below 2 degrees. It is not for lack of knowledge and determination of the concrete and specific requirements, because that's been worked out. There's science to tell us that. There's analysts to tell us that what these concrete and specific requirements are. And it is not for a lack of finance and available technology. The technological requirements of renewable energy systems, for instance, are already there and are already feasible. It is blatantly obvious that too much elite, corporate, and capitalist interests are at stake. They hide their lack of ambition and action, their unwillingness to take on their fair shares of climate action behind the false promises and pursuit of unproven, unreliable, and even dangerous geoengineering technologies, such as carbon capture and storage, or what they call CCS, or in other literature, they call it CCUS technologies, or even BECS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And of course, the usual market mechanisms such as carbon trading and offsets, which have already long proven to be failures. Governments of rich countries are also shifting part of their fair share of climate action onto the global south, while spectacularly refusing to fulfill their legal and ethical obligations to deliver climate finance for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Of course, many don't even bother to hide their lack of ambition or their lack of climate action. And they don't even try to posture as climate champions, and as some governments are trying to claim to be, like the US government in this past year. Movements, of course, have been gaining ground and have achieved important victories, but there is so much more to be fought for. And it's very clear we need to resist the false solutions, but also to exact as much changes as we can from those governments in power today, from their institutions and agencies, from elites and corporations, because concrete wins are very urgent in the next 10 years. There must be clear actions toward rapid, just, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. There must be climate finance as reparations to the global south, and to be spent for the energy and economic transition, for empowering people and communities in the face of climate impacts, and to cover loss and damage. There must be so many other things that have to happen in the next 10 years immediately. But we also have to speed up our efforts to fight for political power, dismantle capitalism, and build a feminist, ecologically sound socialist order. The power we have now, even across the broader front of progressive forces and our allies, is still very short of what is needed to accelerate change. Let us be more bold, ambitious, work harder and faster to build our movements and realize system change. And may I just add, as a parting shot, we are also challenged, and we have been challenged for a long time, to reimagine and redefine our socialist visions, agendas and programs, and even strategies and tactics, given the analysis, agendas, and lessons from socialist feminists and movements fighting patriarchy and inequality, from eco-socialists and movements fighting for climate justice and ecological justice, from movements fighting racism, from indigenous people fighting for their rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Lydie. Now I would like to pass it to Sarah from Socialist Alliance Australia to give her opinions about the climate crisis. I'll pass it to you now, Sarah.
Hi, comrades. Just like to begin by acknowledge that I'm joining you from Wadawurrung country, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, emerging, and note that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you to the organisers of this conference. So our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, made Australia even more of a climate pariah at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Subsequently, the media attempted to distract us here with some confected outrage about Morrison's leak of text messages between him and the French President, Emmanuel Macron, around the cancellation of a submarine deal, but that was far from the truth. The real disaster is the Australian government's refusal to join a global pledge to cut methane emissions. The global methane pledge was one of the key actions that came from COP26.
Hello, Sarah. Sorry to interrupt, but can you go a little bit slower?
I can, sorry.
Okay. It's okay, thank you.
The pledge was announced at a UN General Assembly meeting in September. And over the course of COP26, the number of signatories rose from 60 nations to more than 100. They included the United States, the European Union, and Brazil, all key methane producing countries. China, Russia, India, and Iran, and other big methane emitters also refused to sign up. Australia's Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, said the government had a whole of economy approach and it would not be setting sector-specific targets. Taylor's spurious response stems from his government's overwhelming focus on the exploration, mining, and export of gas. This was very apparent at COP26, where we had the oil and gas company Santos as a prominent feature on the Australian pavilion, apparently at the Energy Minister's invitation. The Australian government's plan for net zero emissions by 2050 includes no specific gas or industry targets and no new policies. It relies on untested carbon capture and storage technology, all the while continuing to allow for a rise in fossil fuel emissions. So, worse than a fringe dweller, Morrison was actively involved in undermining the G20 climate goals at the Rome summit just prior to COP26, as well as leading the opposition to the 2030 methane emission reduction pledge. He also successfully opposed plans to phase out coal power and advanced economies by 2030. Further, Scott Morrison used his final comments to the summit to oppose the abolition of fossil fuels and demanded that the focus be on adaptation and empowerment. The G20 summit did not adopt a firm goal for net zero by 2050. Instead, it agreed to end public financing for coal power plants, but without exact dates and with words implying the importance of reaching net zero by or around the middle of the century. It is clear that while other capitalist powers want to push a more climate-friendly image, they were also happy for Morrison to push his climate denier barrow. United States President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson want to look good, something that Scott Morrison helps them achieve, without fundamentally challenging corporate fossil fuel interests. So despite finally signing on to a net zero 2050 target, the Australian government's target of a 26 to 28% reduction in carbon emissions compared to 2005 levels by 2030 lags behind other capitalist countries. The United States is aiming to reduce emissions by at least 50%, and Britain is aiming for more than 60%. There is a widespread understanding and growing proof that renewable energies are reliable, cheaper than fossil fuels, and would create more jobs. Green capitalists, with the support of governments, are deploying them. However, their solution to the climate emergency will not come by waiting for the market to catch up. United States climate activist Bill McKibben spoke on Australia's ABC 7:30 report early in November, stating that the market will ultimately force a change away from fossil fuels. However, he said ultimately is not good enough for the crisis that we're facing. Emissions from fossil fuel use in industry, transport, and mining have continued to rise, despite a temporary reduction at the start of the pandemic. Even if we could all change from gas-powered energy to solar rooftops, this does not change what McKibben described as the carbon and emissions deeply embedded in the guts of the system. Rather than focusing on lifestyle change, the real job of individuals, he said, is to join together to force basic political and economic change that will rip carbon out of the guts of these systems. Most of the media coverage and advocacy at COP26 has been severely misinformed. Politicians, business leaders, journalists, and NGO advocates talk about net zero 2050 and the 1.5 degree Paris goal in the same breath and get away with it. This gross underestimation of the climate condition is delusional, and very few seem to be calling it out. Net zero 2050 is a con, as Climate Code Red has reported over and over again, as did a breakthrough report published in August this year. Central bankers have used the net zero 2050 scenarios in which fossil fuels constitute 50% of primary energy use in 2050. When the Murdoch media endorses net zero 2050 climate goal, you know it's the problem and not the answer. 2050 is so far away, it's a reason for procrastination. Even net zero 2050 and a coal phase out did not pass muster in Glasgow. China is aiming for net zero by 2060 and India for net zero by 2070. But 2050 is not the critical goal. 2025 and 2030 need to be the focus, and COP26 has not approached anything close of resembling what needs to be done. The models producing 1.5 degree scenarios are also not up to scratch. Current climate models are not capturing all of the risks, including the stalling of the Gulf Stream, polar ice melts, and the uptick in extreme weather events. Carbon dioxide and methane release from deep permafrost are routinely not included in the climate models. Beyond the make-believe of 1.5 degree scenarios full of overshoot, technological dreaming, high risk of failure, and not fully accounting for carbon cycle feedback, there are some basic realities. The first is that the world is likely to hit 1.5 degree average global warming by 2030, regardless of the emission path over the next decade. Warming is already at 1.2 degrees Celsius, and the most recent IPCC report shows that current climate models project on average a warming of 0.3 degrees Celsius for the decade to 2030. Secondly, there is no carbon budget for a 1.5 degree target. It is a figment of modelers' imaginations. Renowned climate scientists and former head of climate at NASA, James Hansen, warned that the rate of global warming during the next 25 years could be double what it was in the previous 50 years. Rising emissions, declining aerosols, and natural climate cycles will contribute to faster warming, as will greater stratification of the ocean with a hotter layer of water on top. Thirdly, to have a low risk of not overshooting 2 degrees warming, emissions need to be zero by 2030. Even with a higher risk of overshoot, emissions need to be halved by 2030. And that scenario includes a substantial amount of carbon drawdown. By way of comparison, it is likely that national emissions reduction pledges that actually have policies to go with them will result in global emissions by 2030 not being substantially lower than 2020, and perhaps much worse. In September this year, the IPCC reported that global emissions will rise 16% by 2030 based on the 2010 levels. This is under government's current plans put forward since the start of 2020. So where does this lead us? Professor Hans Schellenhuber, the Director Emeritus of the Potsdam Institute, is blunt. He says, "I'm telling you that we're putting our kids onto a global school bus that with 98% probability will end in a deadly crash." And the reason is simple. Glasgow has not gotten us within a mile of pledges to halve emissions by 2030. And any reputable climate scientist will say that means warming is going to shoot past 2 degrees. That then gets us into the land of accelerated carbon cycle feedbacks of such magnitude that another degree becomes likely. And why is that? Because capitalism isn't going to fix itself. It is an inherently profit-driven, extractivist, and destructive system. It's a system that is not broken. It is working as it was intended and is therefore not able to be fixed. At this point, anyone who doesn't explicitly state this or tries to claim that we vote or consume our way out of a climate crisis ranges somewhere between misinformed to a con artist. This year, the United Nations Secretary General sounded the climate code red alarm as the IPCC report was released. If this change in rhetoric is to mean anything, it is this. Forget about 2050. What we do in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years matters most. The Washington Post published an analysis on November 7 saying that many countries underreport their greenhouse gas emissions in their reports to the United Nations. This shows that capitalist governments around the world are still more deeply committed to maintaining the polluting status quo than taking the action needed to avert climate catastrophe. And despite his post-Glasgow conversion to electric cars, Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison stands exposed as a climate laggard. But the Australian Labor Party opposition is still walking down both sides of the street. Labor's climate spokesperson, Chris Bowen, gave a demonstration of this on Australia's ABC Insiders. He claimed that a Labor government will take methane seriously and that it has plans in place to reduce methane emissions by working cooperatively with industry and agriculture. Just recently, the Australian Labor Party announced emission reduction targets of 43% by 2030. This approach is completely at odds with what is needed to stay as close as possible to the 1.5 degree target and to give our species the best possible chance of avoiding an unlivable hothouse Earth scenario. However, it is in keeping with the policies of US President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. While talking big on climate, Biden is so far refusing to halt at least 24 key fossil fuel projects. Similarly, Johnson is promising that Britain's domestic power production will go fossil fuel free by 2035. But he is still approving new fossil fuel developments, such as the controversial Cambo oil field of Scotland. Targets for 2050 are decades too late. Immediate term emission reductions are essential. However, on any time frame, net zero is a fraud. It's a means by which governments and corporations plan to continue polluting while supposedly offsetting these continuing emissions. This promotes the dodgy carbon accounting practices that have been highlighted again and again. So to conclude, the most important events at the United Nations COP26 occurred not inside, but in meetings and demonstrations outside. Some 100,000 people, mostly young, marched for climate justice in Glasgow on November 6. Morrison, along with Murdoch, Putin, Trump, Bolsonaro, were all correctly identified as climate criminals. However, it's not about the individuals. It's about the economic system of capitalism that is not broken, it's working as it intended, and will continue to drive us over the edge of climate catastrophe. The lesson from COP26 is that it's not enough to just change an extreme climate foot-dragging government for a seemingly climate-friendly, big-talking, but small-action capitalist alternative. We need a people-powered revolt against them both. We need less blah, 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 as Greta says. Politicians of one ilk or another are not going to save us. Neither is Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos by sending us into space. However, it might be helpful if they put themselves and the likes of Gina Reinhart and Twiggy Forrest and Rupert Murdoch in a rocket and fired them directly into the sun. We need an eco-socialist alternative that puts people and planet before profits. And the best way to achieve this is by working in broad fronts, coalitions with other left and activist organisations and individuals to achieve demands through democratic grassroots organising. And one example of this is a local campaign to oppose a gas import terminal in Corio Bay, which is where I live, which if I go this way would look something like this in the middle of our bay. We need a mass action strategy approach that is going to speak to students, to climate activists, to refugee rights activists, to white collar professional types and blue collar workers in industry. Then we need to take this approach into the electoral sphere in a serious way and challenge the status quo on every platform we can get on, and create our own platforms and alternative sources of media to get the message out. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Comrade Sarah. Now, I would like to welcome our third panelist, Melisa from Extinction Rebellion Indonesia, to talk about it. The floor is yours, Melisa.
Thanks, everyone. Hi again. My name is Melisa. I'm from Jakarta, Indonesia. I'm just gonna share screen if that's okay. Sorry, just
okay.
Enabled it.
Hello, ได้ยินนะครับ
Great. So our world is currently stuck in a self-destruct system, a capitalistic system.
เขาบอกว่าโลกเราตอนนี้กำลังอยู่ในระบบที่เป็นระบบที่เรียก self destruction ทำลายตัวเองนะครับนั่นก็คือระบบดังกล่าวก็คือระบบทุนนิยมนั่นเองนะครับ
Sorry, hold on. I'm hearing the interpretation. I'm not sure why it's already off. Okay, let me try again.
You can try again now.
We basically live in a capitalistic system where countries' goals have been centered around infinite growth of a single accepted standard, the GDP, or what most people know as the economy. But as we have seen in recent years, this pursuit of infinite growth year on year is leading us to a systemic destruction of our planet, which clearly is causing us this climate crisis. Now, the GDP, or the gross domestic product, is a measure of how much value has reportedly been created in terms of goods and services produced in a time span of 1 year within a country. Now, sadly, while measuring itself with money, the GDP gives zero regards to who it goes to or where it comes from. In fact, in Indonesia in 2019, only 15% of the GDP actually goes out as wages to the people who work to create the value, and the rest goes to capital holders. But equity aside, this maximizes the money system is fundamentally flawed because it only cares that things are monetized and that it grows. So a system that makes more people sick over time, or where people can't afford homes and must pay rent, or where the air is so polluted that people have to pay for its solutions, would be considered great for the economy, simply because, above all, these would be making monetary values. Now, this economic system, by design, creates a system that encourages us to always produce more and more, as if this planet has infinite resources, free for us to extract and exploit. Now, this mentality, in turn, creates a system of innovation, marketing, and advertising that trains and manipulates us into demanding whatever is produced, even to the point of providing loans and credits to enable us to demand them, creating a consumerist world and a way of life that sadly revolves around how much and not at what cost. But at a fundamental level, the GDP is flawed because it also fails to recognize and include any other values and activities outside of this formal taxable economy, values that are integral to life and well-being to the people and the nation. So in relation to Indonesian economy, beyond the formal market-based economy, we have the informal sector, where actually majority of Indonesians actually work. So these are your single farmers, food vendors, craftsmen, but also informal teachers, or basically anyone else earning money without reporting for tax. But beyond this, there are all sorts of life-giving activities like growing your own food, foraging from the forest, generation of renewable energy, making your own items, DIY, natural water supply, walking, clean air, things that you can get without the need of money, at least after its first purchase. Activities that don't demand more than our world can provide for. And the indigenous communities are the embodiment of this way of life, who live in harmony with nature, and yet they're considered poor in the current system. In fact, a family who grows their own food, has a micro hydro attached to their own river behind their house for electricity, gets clean water from the river, and is always healthy and self-sufficient, is considered living in poverty on paper, as it does not contribute to this GDP or national economy. And on the other hand, maximizing the recorded national economy is the country's priority, which is translated at every level of government, where the performance of local leaders are tied to their region's contribution towards their GDP. So now we ask, what's the quickest way to achieve this contribution? There are two ways: converting these non-GDP activities into GDP and allowing big-scale industrial investments to enter the region. And in Indonesia, sadly, the most scalable and economically attractive investments do come from the extractive industries. So these are your coal, mining, infrastructure, monoculture plantations, which are not only high on emission, very land intensive, but have and will continue to destroy the ecosystem, including the ones that give the people direct livelihood from these non-GDP activities. So of course, it's only instinctual for local communities to reject these investments and stop their land from being destroyed or polluted. But again, the system encourages these investments to take place to, on paper, grow and lift people off poverty. And since these investments lead to private profits, local governments tend to get monetary benefits to make these investments work, regardless of the people's opinion. So conflict then becomes unavoidable, which often leads to land grabbing and criminalization of the local communities. Ironically, these investments in these industries are considered justified because after it directly kills the local informal economy, the livelihood of the community is now forced to be dependent on the formal economy, since they now have to start earning money to buy things that from the recorded market that they would otherwise get for free, adding further into the GDP and reinforcing the need for the investment to begin with, and eventually creating a vicious cycle where we are actively killing our inherent ways of living and life on the place itself to sustain a system that is not sustaining us. Because at the end of the day, we have to remember that the essence of economy is about fulfillment of needs, not money. And after all, when the last tree is cut, the last fish eaten, the last stream poisoned, you realize you cannot eat money. And this phrase has never been so relevant to today's world, because this is precisely what awaits us at the end of the way as the climate crisis gets worse, and it will. And ironically, the solutions that we know the solutions that we know are needed to get us out of the climate crisis are actually bad for GDP in this capitalistic growth system. Sustainable living, slow living, being a conscious consumer, growing your own food, buying items that last, composting, making your own things, decentralized renewable energy, renewable anything that requires you to spend once and then build yourself or continuously live off it, no longer having an economic value in the formal GDP system. These are all going to be destruction for the growth system now. So if the future that we need is the opposite of the country's goal, it's definitely time to reevaluate the goal itself. Now, let's remind ourselves, what is the function of a country? Ensuring the welfare of its people, maybe, making sure no one is left behind, fulfilling the basic needs of everyone. Now, what if countries make that into a goal, working directly to ensure the welfare of the people? Instead of maximizing the amount of money created in the formal sector so that people can afford to buy things for them to live, why not flip this completely and strive to minimize the need for money for the people to live freely? That means prioritizing an investment in infrastructure that directly provide basic needs, allowing livelihood to flourish, regenerative in nature, so it will only require a one-off investment and it will just keep giving after. Owned and managed by the communities, so they will be able to simply live with ingenuity and in resonance with their surroundings, but also not vulnerable to market volatility or disasters. Imagine if instead of providing electricity tokens for the quote-unquote poor to continuously pay for the public sector, why not just install microhydro or solar panels in every village? Maybe teach us how to manage and maintain it so that we can achieve energy sovereignty. Instead of providing subsidies to harmful chemical fertilizers that are anyway very high on emission and destructive towards the land, why not make education centers to teach us how to make organic compost everywhere? Instead of providing food vouchers or rice, why not grant us land to farm and create community gardens and communal urban farming? Why not teach permacultures and hydroponics at school? Imagine building community-owned food sovereignty at every level, urban and rural, to ensure no one would ever go hungry. Instead of entire education systems solely designed to prepare us for the job market so that we can make a living, why not encourage us to imagine and realize with real skill sets a life in a world that does not require jobs to keep living? What if governments just invest in life and directly fulfill livelihoods? By investing in community sovereignty, not only will it mitigate the climate crisis through lowering emissions, as well as taking away the need for extractive industries investments to enter, but it will also provide adaptation against the crisis by being more resilient against disasters and global supply chain, which we now know is very fragile anyway from our experiences during the pandemic. And now I'm not saying abolish money. Businesses are of course allowed to maximize profits, and technological developments can continue if there is a natural demand for such, as long as it is within the law and planetary boundaries, not grabbing land from indigenous communities, not destroying protected forests, not dumping toxic waste. Though clearly the law enforcers also need to do a better job punishing those who commit crimes, as opposed to giving awards to those who pay taxes on time, regardless of the crimes they commit, which is what's happening now. But yes, of course, the private sector can exist for money. But the role of the government is not to serve the private shareholders. It is to serve the people. And countries functioning like an extension of the private sector is why nature and people are always sacrificed for profits. So instead of prioritizing businesses, helping corporations maximize profits and depending on them to give the people crumbs, countries can and should just invest in life and in livelihood that are just and regenerative for all. So let's gear our governments to stand for their original purpose, which is the welfare of its people through ensuring fulfillment of needs. Of course, this won't be easy, and it does require a political system change where people power can rise up and real participatory democracy can be achieved. And once we achieve this, we'll see that this will not only solve the climate crisis, achieve true economic justice, but it will also create freedom for all. And I hope that this offers us something to consider moving forward and imagine a better future with, because only with imagination can we fight to make it into a reality. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Melisa. So now we'll move on to the Q&A session. We actually have more than enough time to take questions, so participants are largely encouraged to ask more questions in the Q&A column below. So first off, we have a few questions from our participant, Robert Lurdusami. So this question is directed to all the panelists. So in Malaysia, the executive power to approve any developmental projects falls under the chief minister of each state, which means the minister has absolute power in dictating what projects should be done. And these projects often do not take into considerations of environmental concerns. So Robert asks, how are the situation in the countries of each panelist similar, especially in terms of like governmental aspects and also laws and regulation aspect? So does Lily want to go first for this question?
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
Well, in terms of similarity of situations, of course, there are important differences, but there are also important similarities from country to country. Not all governments have exactly the same kind of policies and climate pledges and so on. But one important thing is that, as I've said in my talk, there's all governments without exception, but especially governments of rich industrialized countries, their pledges, their targets, their plans, their actual policies really fall very short of what's needed for us to stabilize the temperature at the safest level still possible. And that is a moving target. When we started campaigning on climate change, well over 15 years ago, it was keeping it below 1 degree, and now it's keeping it below 1.5. And in a few years, that's going to be off the table, even keeping it below 2 degrees. So that's a very important similarity, but there's also important differences in terms of the rate, speed, and scale of action that is required. One of the principles that we uphold, of course, is that there has to be a fair sharing of climate action based on historical and continuing responsibility, which is also empirically important because, the countries that contributed much less in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and have a shorter history of capitalist industrialization, if it's not quite possible for us to do everything we can, and then we will be able to save the planet. That's impossible without actions appropriate and sufficient actions that have to come from the rich, wealthy countries. I think it's important to note that, because as we make also global demands, not just demands from our movements within our countries, but also global demands, we from the South have to keep in mind that the governments in the North should be as much as our targets and not just focus our efforts on our own governments here in the South, because there's much, much more to be done there where emissions are really huge. And historically, and we're talking historically here, not just because it's part of our principle, but because also greenhouse gases exist in the atmosphere for hundreds and some even thousands of years, and that therefore responsibility is quite different across countries. But the changes that have to be made are also have to be rapid as much as they have to be just. And so we need to be able to look at the whole world and see what the appropriate actions have to be done in each country.
Okay, we'll pass it on to Sarah.
Yeah, I should say I am by no means an expert on this, but I can just give an example of a campaign that I'm currently involved in. So we've got a community campaign to try and stop a proposed gas import terminal in Corio Bay. And this is funded by federal government. However, the company has to go through a process called an environmental effects statement. So supposedly the company has to bring in independent assessors, scientists, marine biologists to assess what impact this project will have on the bay and the environment. And then a legal challenge can be mounted to that report. So various impacted bodies, if we believe the report is lying or they haven't taken into account different factors, we can mount a legal challenge to that report. It's also my understanding that the relevant state government will also have to sign off on a project. All of that aside, you know, if a government really wants a project to go through, it will at the end of the day. So despite all these, I guess, bureaucratic or legal processes that we can use, from experience, it is grassroots campaigning. It is making a project completely politically untenable, that will stop these things from going through, not so much the formal processes that are there.
Okay, Melisa, you can go next.
Yeah. Well, in the case of Indonesia, the government actually is the extractive industry players. In fact, 16 out of 30 of the current ministers are mine owners or players. 55% of the House of Parliament positions now are held by business owners. And most of the businesses are in agroforestries and infrastructure and energy and mining owners and whatnot. So it is, the government is the extractive industry. So all the policies that have been geared in the past few years have all been enabling these extractive industries to go ahead and benefit more. And even the entire model for Indonesia now is building more Indonesia Maju, and it's all about infrastructure building, to the point that the Ministry of Environment actually came up with a tweet, was a very controversial tweet during the COP26, after countries signed pledges to zero deforestation in 2030. And the Ministry of Environment came up with a tweet that says, Indonesia can't possibly commit to zero deforestation because we have to still grow, and this massive scale growth of development cannot stop just for emissions. So it's very clear that the government don't really have the understanding of basic science to that level, that we need to stop our ways, which is really sad considering it's this year alone, we already have more than 7.6 million people having to take refuge and suffer from the climate crisis disaster. So, but yeah, that's definitely the case in Indonesia. That's exactly why we need an entire system change, because the entire system is run by extractive industries here.
Thank you to all panelists. So here's another question from Robert also. So sea level rise is one of the most concerning and costly effects of climate change. So it's always caused by deforestation, failure to protect mangrove forests, urbanization, improper waste management. So are countries like the Philippines, Australia, or Indonesia doing enough to protect mangrove forests? And also, most importantly, forest covers? Yes, so Lydie, do you want to go first?
Again? Yeah. Well, we cannot just blame the current government. Government after government that has been destroying our environment, our natural resources. Oh, I think I'm hearing the interpretation. Something, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll continue. The Philippines has very little virgin forests left. So we used to have a lot. It's now less than probably 1%. And so it has been a whole history of destruction of our forests. There's no preparation for sea level rise at all. We've been pressuring the government to declare what is their plan for this. So definitely the government is not only failing to do enough, but also has been actively perpetrating the destruction of our environment and pursuing policies that are contrary to their stated commitment to combat climate change. So while we are pressuring our government to do what it must, because it is its responsibility and duty, or to stop what the clearly wrong things that are happening. We're also working very hard to make sure there is a change in the regime, because we can't just stop at demanding from governments what they must do. We have to be prepared to transform governments, to change the regimes, the political regimes.
Okay, thank you, Lydie. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Our government is not doing anywhere near enough to stop deforestation. Just an example of where I'm from. So I'm in Victoria, which is the southeast corner of Australia. And we've still got issues here of logging companies logging old growth forests. So these are trees like up to 600 years old that are being cut down with impunity. We supposedly have a progressive Labor state government, and they're just not doing enough. And more often than not, it relies on what we call citizen scientists who are going out into these old growth forests trying to track down particular trees that are 300, 400, 500 years old, so they can put up a flag, report it back to government, and try and stop the logging companies from coming in. But yeah, there's certainly more that the government could be doing in that space.
Melisa?
Yeah, I think in the case of Indonesia, the government is actively running towards the wrong direction still. I'm sure some of you have heard that Indonesia is now entering its lowest deforestation rate in 20 years. I think in 2020 it was 115,000 hectares. But on paper that we have submitted as part of the Paris Climate Agreement in the NDC and the long-term strategy, this number has actually been increased again, where we have planned deforestation of 6.8 million hectares till 2050. And I mean, it's just insane, right? Like, so even on paper, they are planning to deforest much more and much faster than the rate of deforestation in the past year. And then beyond this, as I mentioned earlier, there's been so many policies that comes out that actually dismantles protection against deforestation further. One of them is called the Omnibus Law, which is really controversial. And actually the High Court had just decided that it's unconstitutional, but it's still going to go ahead anyway. The president came up with a statement that said that, yeah, regardless of the unconstitutional verdict, don't worry, investors, this will still take place. And one of the laws says that It removes the need for 30% of an island to be kept as forests, which was a regulation in the Ministry of Environment. And now this is gone under this law. So it's very clear that we are not doing, it's not that we're not doing enough, we're still actively making things worse. And this is also portrayed in all our spendings that is still geared towards infrastructure projects that has no protection for the indigenous communities. We still have really high land grabbing cases against the indigenous communities. We still don't have the Indigenous Rights Bill that's been in the talks for the past 11 years and still nothing. So yeah, it's not doing enough. Oh, also, by the way, our net zero goal is 2060 or sooner. So it's not enough at all. Yeah.
Thank you to all panelists. So now there are questions from S. Kumar. How would the panelists explain the role of workers in big oil companies in the agenda for a just transition? Are there any examples of success? So does anyone want to take this question? Maybe one panelist.
Well, I can maybe start off with some things and ask my co-panelists to add. I think really we need to do a lot more in terms of organizing workers in the energy sector, especially in the fossil fuel sector. In this case, you were asking about workers in oil companies, but there's also workers in the coal industry and in the fossil gas industry. There's still, when we started talking about climate change among our member organizations, which included trade unions in different Asian cities, like about 15 years ago, one of the stark responses I got in one forum was that they thought the move against the fossil industry was anti-worker. That was exactly the term that they used. Because of course, what to them in the immediate, for them, that would mean loss of jobs. Right. So this was a trade union leader who was working with federated unions in the coal sector of India. And that's how they thought 15 years ago. And I dare say there's been a lot of change since then, but there's still kind of something like knee-jerk reactions among trade union workers, even especially also unorganized workers in the energy, in the fossil fuel sector, because I think thus far we have failed to be more concrete and louder in our demands that it's not just any energy transition from fossils to renewable energy we are demanding, that we are demanding a just transition that requires that workers, communities who will be affected by that transition will have real alternative jobs and livelihoods, so that they don't end up, not only don't they end up in a worse situation, but that the just transition aims to actually improve on the quality of life and their working conditions, not just, just find them any old job. There's an important movement that actually started in Africa, South Africa, but also has gained ground in other countries. And I hope that also kinds of come more alive here in Asia, for what they call the climate jobs. So a demand for millions of climate jobs, because in the transition, not just in energy, but in the economic transition out of capitalism to socialism, we should be able to generate alternative jobs, not just any job, but alternative jobs that will be not just environmentally and climate friendly, but is part of the transition and reconstruction to an alternative social order, and that we need to be a lot more concrete about that. We also need to be a lot louder and demanding from our governments and the governments of rich industrialized countries, because it is, after all, supposedly part of their legal obligations under the Climate Convention to provide climate finance for that transition. And one of the major requirements for finance is the building of alternative jobs, of economic diversification, for instance, because as Melisa said, in Indonesia, for instance, a large part of government revenues is tied up with the coal mining industry. So you need economic diversification in a manner that brings you to more sustainable and equitable economic systems out of economies that are so dependent on the fossil fuel industry. And that's a challenge to us, I believe, that we need to be more concrete, granular, and real and louder in our demands, because these are the big realities that the working class will face in industries that will have to be phased out if we want to save ourselves from climate catastrophe.
Okay, thank you, Lily. So the next question, does the concept of a just transition resonates with the working class in your respective local contexts? If not, what are alternative languages that organizers can use in climate organizing work? Sarah, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it kind of feeds off from what Liddy was saying. I like that term you used, Liddy, climate jobs, because or green jobs. I think that's much more explicit. The feedback that we've had from energy sector blue collar jobs is that, well, what does just transitions mean? Like, it's fluff, it means nothing, and people don't actually know what it is we're asking for. So it just kind of becomes this vague, nebulous statement. Whereas, yeah, if we talk about climate jobs or green jobs, that's quite useful, and also start to get more specific. So there have been a number of organizations here who have put the research into a 1 million jobs plan. And so it's 20,000 jobs in energy, 100,000 jobs in retrofitting housing, and they've mapped it all out. So all that work is there. And that gives us even more specific, clear demands of, we want 20,000 jobs building houses because we've got a housing affordability crisis, or we want 100,000 jobs in renewable energy. I guess just the other point I wanted to raise as part of this is the gender equity aspect of it, because there's a lot of focus when we talk about just transitions or sustainability. I think we immediately think of our energy sector. So let's stop doing coal and gas and let's do solar and wind. And these are largely male-dominated industries. So a question that we've been thinking through in Geelong is, well, where are the jobs for women in all of this? Are we going to create opportunities in the energy sector? Or when we talk about sustainability, is that broader? Are we talking about health and education and all these other industries? So yeah, I think that's something else to include in the mix. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Next up is a question from Xiaofui Chen about REDD, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So Xiaofui Chen asks, would funds from the REDD Plus save deforestation? And also, do you think that climate litigation can be a strategy to combat the climate crisis? And also, is the justice system in your respective countries equipped to handle cases like this? Okay. Melisa, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, can. So the REDD has been going on in Indonesia for a while, actually, but recently we cut the agreement with Norway that is providing those funds one-sided. The excuse that was given by the Indonesian government was because Norway was not dispersing the funds properly. But it didn't really work over the years because it was very controlled by the government, the disbursement of the funds, the choosing the projects, the maintenance and the evaluation and everything. It was all through the government, so it was not handled properly. Projects were given to big corporations that was doing reforestation and protecting forests. I mean, we know that the indigenous communities are the best guardians for deforestation. The easiest thing to do is give them full rights over their own land, but this is sadly not the case yet. So with that, it was still very lacking. And I think this is also true of any funding where the funds can only go through the government. There's going to be that political issue still, where it's going to be used constantly for big players, which are basically their own circle of friends. Yeah, sorry, what was the second part of the question? Oh, the climate justice, right? Yeah.
Climate litigation.
Yeah, litigation is, I'm personally very excited for it. We're also working for a litigation in Indonesia, still working on it. But it does provide a very eye-opening to public that this is serious enough to sue your own government for it. And I think it makes a very important part of the fight. I think more litigation should pop out everywhere, and it's been happening. But of course, in countries where the science of climate crisis hasn't been a norm yet, is very difficult for the justice system to take this into consideration and say like, okay, yeah, it is actually an intergenerational justice issue. It is actually the government killing us issue. So we are having problems with that right now in Indonesia, where we are very worried that the justice system will just not understand it even. So it does take quite some time to build these understandings. But I mean, there's no other choice, right? Like, this is a necessary path that we have to take everywhere. So just keep going.
Hey, thank you, Melisa. So does anyone wants to continue with the question, or should we move on to the other one? The one about climate litigation.
Maybe just short addition. I think in whatever fight, including climate, let's not remove litigation off the table. We just need to be quite smart and realistic how we're going to locate litigation in our strategy for battle. Because of course, it's not just about winning the case, because in some cases, even if we know we might lose, or will probably lose, we still file cases because, as Melisa said, it opens raises public awareness and so on. So there are other objectives that we can actually accomplish other than the actual winning of the litigation case. So we use that, and I think that's, no matter how flawed the justice system in your country, there's some instances where litigation can actually, prove to be useful in your campaigning. But we have to be quite clear how, when, and for what we're going to use it, because I don't believe relying on the justice system is going to take us far, right?
Okay, thank you, Lydie. Okay, so the next question is from Vivian Langford. So this question is for Sarah. So the question goes, Australia is set to become a massive exporter of renewable energy via hydrogen or via undersea cables to Singapore and Indonesia. So far, there is no talk of this being publicly owned or controlled, even though big subsidies are flowing from the government. Should this be a cornerstone of our demands that energy is community-owned?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Vivian. Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's a tendency in the climate campaign space that we'll take any win we can get, no matter how small. And so as soon as there's an announcement of a green energy project, and there's been a few in recent months around green hydrogen, we all cheer and we go, great, job done. Like, we've won that. Let's move on to the next one. And yeah, we're definitely not having enough discussion around community ownership or public ownership more broadly, let alone in this energy space. And, this is a particular issue, I think, in sort of rural and regional communities where we've had massive campaigns in some states to stop fracking or fracked gas because there was no community consultation, no community ownership. But then at the same time, we've also had some community pushback around wind turbines and building wind turbines on their land with no community consultation. So, you know, even in the renewable energy space, we can't just sort of come in and say we're doing this. We do need to bring communities along with us, and we do need to be putting forward the demands of community ownership and just energy sector generally, bringing that back into public hands, and taking it out of the private sector completely.
Thank you, Sarah. So for the next question, how do we argue the contradiction of pushing for green tech where lithium batteries are required, and adversely that would require more mining extraction? Is there another way to justify this green tech, or should we? So maybe this could be a question for all the panelists. Yeah, does Lady wants to go first?
Yeah, there's so much technology that we ourselves rely on, including computers, right? That tells us that, of course, it's not actually feasible to say we absolutely stop mining everything right now, tomorrow. I think the solution there is to have much more ambitious planning about alternatives so that one day we actually have economies that are not reliant on extractivist practices and industries. Even for now, renewable energy technology is not completely independent from extractivism, because there are rare earth materials that is needed for solar panels, even for wind turbines and so on. So we have to be a lot more, clear about the scale and pace of winding down mining. And we need to begin with, there's so much problems with large scale mining to begin with that we need, there's a lot of wins that we have to make before we actually reach a point where we can completely do away with that. And so one example is the lithium batteries, but there's also examples embedded in the renewable energy system that we also want to scale up. And I must reinforce the message that we need to demand decentralized, redistributed, community-based, and public or socialized energy systems that we can't afford to replace, even if it were possible to completely replace fossil fuels with corporate dominated renewable energy systems. I don't think corporations will actually just go for completely renewable, but that's not the kind of alternative that we want to build. So in much the same way that we can't just accept any kind of renewable energy systems, we need to be able to make sure that the plan that we are going to pursue is also going to make sure eventually in the end it's not still reliant on extractivism. And I might just add, it's also there are so many complex things to sort out. For instance, large-scale renewable energy systems like big solar farms also threaten other aspects like food security, food sovereignty, because they kind of occupy, there's land grabs involved in setting up big solar farms, for instance. So they kind of occupy precious land that we should be devoting to producing staple food for our own population. So there's no like quick silver bullet responses to these alternatives. They all have to be planned out quite carefully, and we need to lay out our parameters and principles quite clearly from the beginning, what we exactly mean.
Okay, thank you, Lydie. So we'll move on to the next question. So this question is related to the workers' movement and perhaps more specifically the Omnibus Law. So for workers like us, could we raise demands for a fully nationalized and greener transport system, or make one-day strikes and advocate for the stop or limit of the fossil fuel industry and build nuclear power station? So is there any scope for a concrete solidarity action among workers that could be helpful in the Indonesian people's resistance against the Omnibus Law? So Melisa, perhaps you could answer this question in the context of the Omnibus Law and how the actions of the protesters.
Yeah, in regards to the Omnibus Law, I think what we are seeing is actually different movements joining hands together to fight this massive law. It's for those who don't know, it's a 900-page bill that was formalized in secret and in rushed on a weekend, despite millions of people protesting against it, and many different communities and academias and whatnot have all voiced their concerns towards it. And this is also the law that was deemed unconstitutional. So yes, it does see a rise of solidarity in terms of that this bill represents all the oppression of the country towards its people, no matter where you're from. It goes beyond workers. It's environmental rights, is obviously workers' rights as well, but indigenous communities and well, basically everybody. So it does provide that, but what we are missing so far is what's next. Indonesia has such a big culture of going to the streets and protesting, and this culture of protests have been sadly ridden by a lot of political agendas as well, where people have rallied different groups of extremists and whatnot, calling out random things that are so not necessary for our country, but and most of those are paid. So we still need to break out of that mold, because there's still a stigma of people being in the street is equal riots and whatnot. So although we have seen this huge solidarity, we still need a pathway. Like, what is the pathway? These people are demanding what? Because a lot of it is still take down the Omnibus Law, for example, but not necessarily a long-term changing the system permanently. And there's still a lot of questions on whether or not the best way to go is through an alternative political party, or just taking over the government, or whatnot, like the 98. So it's still in the questions. But yeah, I still think it's a positive, the fact that the government got really greedy under this regime, and a lot of their industry players are now holding positions of power, because they are able to come up with this massive law that is bad for everyone. And people are starting to wake up to it, and people are starting to join hands and whatnot, cross boundary beyond workers, actually. So so with labor, with the farmers, with the students, university students and whatnot. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Okay, thank you, Melisa. So this is a question for all panelists. So politicians and corporations are always trying to shift the blame of carbon emissions to the individual. How do you get over the individual guilt that has been brought by this? And also, how do you convince people around you to hold the capitalist class accountable and make them do something about it? So what the participants wants to hear is like concrete steps, or what are the concrete steps can common people take to make the government and also the capitalist class more accountable? Yeah, so perhaps Lily can go first.
Yeah, before that question, I just want to respond to the question about the nationalized and greener transport system, or to go on one-day strike against the fossil fuel industry and nuclear power stations. I think we need to do both. It's not either or. We need to, fight for a green transport system and nationalize. It's not quite that, of course, fairly straight and simple. One of our experiences here in the Philippines is, of course, we have a large jeepney transport sector, and they're either individually owned or they're small operators and the drivers. So if we suddenly just out of the blue, out of context, demand that the transport system be nationalized, you'll be finding a lot of workers that will be out of jobs. So I think we need to work out a plan how to address that. And because one of the most important sector to win over in a transport campaign, in a green transport campaign, is the workers of the transportation sector themselves. And then, of course, we need to also equally fight the fossil fuel industry and nuclear power stations. And let's not just aim for one-day strikes. I think we need to have repeated general strikes against the systems and other issues. And then just on this, the second question, how do we convince individuals? I mean, I think it's very important to start with explanations and education about how this whole thing works. You can't, of course, get away from the fact that individual actions matter. That's why we also try to have lifestyle changes, but we need to explain that even if we all change our lifestyles and do small things to make our lives more ecologically friendly and greener, unless we change the system, that will not matter much in the grand scheme of things. When we would do, climate seminars in small communities here in the Philippines, the first thing that people respond to in terms of what they are willing to do is tree planting, because that's what they've been told. And we need to explain that, of course, that helps a little bit, but even if we all plant 1,000 trees, each of us, even if we had the space here in the Philippines, unless we transform the system and then explain what the system is all about and what the big corporations are doing and so on, that's also not going to matter much in the big scheme of things. So there's nothing to replace, good old-fashioned organizing and explanation to people around you, and to convince them that the best thing is to get ourselves organized and do actions together instead of just do individual actions. I think we have a big challenge because there's also this whole world of digital activism, which has its importance. I'm not undervaluing it. It's one of the things we're also trying to scale up, especially under the COVID conditions where people are isolated and we only are able to communicate online, even targeting the corporations and governments. A lot of the platforms are online, but we really need to build a lot of awareness that there's nothing that beats collective face-to-face actions of people in the streets, in our communities, in the factories, so we need to really reclaim that and build that culture and understanding that people's mobilizations matter a lot.
Thank you, Liddy. Sarah, do you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with everything Liddy just said. We've been sitting at home in COVID lockdown for close to 2 years in Victoria. And I think Melbourne was one of the most locked down cities. So we are well and truly, sick of the Zoom meetings. We're keen to get back out on the streets and to do that on the ground activism. And, I think it links back to a previous question around the lithium batteries and, individual choices. But under this system, whatever it is that's being produced, we know it's going to be produced in the most polluting, extractivist, exploitative way, whether that's coal or solar panels or vegan food or bamboo toothbrushes. It's all the same thing. So, absolute all power to you if you're vegan and you do the right things and you use the right light bulbs and whatever it is. But maybe the best way we can explain it is by people individualizing this blame that my choices are going to make or break the planet. It's almost a form of gaslighting. It's convincing us that our individual choices are destroying this planet. And that's what we need to counter. It doesn't matter at the end of the day, really, what we do on an individual level. It's all about the system. And we can't, take down this system individually in our lounge rooms online as much as we like to. We need to get out on the streets and do it collectively.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Melisa, you can answer next.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. This is also a problem everywhere. Well, normally what we do in XR Indonesia is we highlight that, of course, this is only relevant to some countries, but there's some data that you can always churn out. So say like 1% of the richest people in the world emits more than double than the poorest 50% of the world. But of course, that doesn't work if you're the one who's jet setting all the time. But it does work for a lot of people that are not really high emitters, like Indonesia. There's also other data that you can use. So again, for Indonesia, 50% of all the emissions actually come from the land use and forest sector. And this is a sector that's supposed to be a negative because, I mean, that's the function of a forest. So this also we use as an explanation. So even if we all live in a cave, this will still happen because forests will keep being destroyed to make way for things that are going to be shipped as exports or being made into roads that nobody needs, and things like that. So those help, but also providing explanation about how most people don't really have a choice, right? Most people don't have a choice. In Indonesia, the cheapest oil is palm oil. And how can you possibly tell somebody who is struggling to make ends meet to change into a virgin coconut oil? It just doesn't make sense. Just like plastic is something that everybody was taught since childhood that it's actually hygienic to use plastic, right? Single-use plastic, so that it doesn't contaminate and whatnot. And these are not things that is by choice. We were born and live into the system that tells you that these things are good. So I think by providing these informations, but yes, of course, it's still a one-on-one organizing style, I guess, to explain these things. Haven't got a formula to easily roll this out either. And maybe by providing the alternative would also be good. So things like, this is why I think sovereignty is very important. I think people, if they're provided with infrastructure that gives them these fulfillment of needs for free, they wouldn't need to choose between the bad or the good because they'll just be provided for free. And people always choose the free alternative. So yeah, I think that's potentially another way to tackle it.
Okay, hold on. Okay, this is a question for all the panelists. So any panelists can just opt to answer. So for all the organizing work that you all have done, are there any successful stories or lessons on mobilization to make the government listen to our demands? Yeah. So anybody wants to go?
Are you talking about climate demands or are you talking about general?
Climate demands. Climate demands, yeah.
Well, I think there are smaller wins that we have been achieving along the way in the fossil fuel fights, for instance, and also in terms of wins in terms of how government has been responding to climate-related disasters and impacts on local population. The wins are small compared to what we need to achieve, but nevertheless, they've been really hard fought. And these are using a combination of different actions from local community resistance, such as what Sarah was describing happening in her place, in her community or town. It's also combining with big nationally coordinated mobilizations in several cities to challenge particular policies or to emphasize what people are clamoring for all over. It also involves some litigation tactics. For instance, when we were able to stall power purchase agreements between a major electricity utility and power generation providers that are using fossil fuels. So for instance, things like this. So I guess the major lesson is we really have to fight in different forms and in different arenas, and to combine these different elements of our fights in a really systematic and smart way so that we can generate these wins. My personal vision on climate is for us to generate the kind of mobilizations and even more and even bigger that we generated when we were bringing down the dictator Marcos in the Philippines. So we had not just hundreds of thousands of people on the street, we had millions of people on the street in the final days of the ousting, for instance. There were so many different forms of struggles that we tried, and some very successful at, including general strikes and people's strikes, combining student boycotts, teachers also walking out, transport strikes, and workers walking out and declaring a strike from in their factories. So all of these combined, which we used to call people's strikes. That's my dream, that we wake people up to the huge and urgent imperatives of climate change, so that people will be willing to make these daring actions, and even to the point of having maybe uprisings, urban uprisings. I mean, this is the kind of bolder actions that we need to aim for if what we're really aiming for is system change. Not saying that electoral participation is not important, also hugely important, but we know that our struggle is beyond just simply trying to effect change in the electoral arena. So we need to be a little bit bolder in dreaming about what kind of actions we want to be capable of.
Thank you so much, Lily. So here's one last question before we wrap up. So universal basic income, UBI, is one of the tools to ease people from extractivism and high pollution work. So how do you think UBI implementation can help in alleviating the environmental and climate issue? So Sarah, do you want to take this question?
Yes, thank you. It's an interesting one. I haven't really given much thought to how UBI would play a role in this space. I guess one of the issues we're up against here is that the jobs that we would like to see go are highly skilled, very highly paid jobs. So it's a bit hard to sort of, you know, let's say, let's get rid of those jobs. So for example, the company that wants to bring in this gas import terminal currently operates an oil refinery, also in my community. We're lots of fun here. So it's the last oil refinery in Australia. And they've got a small number of operators at this oil refinery that are very highly paid. So it would not win us any friends if we came in and said, let's close this oil refinery down, let's get rid of their jobs, and you can all go on a UBI, because, you know, they wouldn't be able to maintain their standard of living. So, you know, I guess in that sense, the case for green jobs or just transitions is better. However, I do think the UBI would play a role, I guess, particularly in lower socioeconomic communities, which is also the community I'm in. We have a really high unemployment rate, one of the highest unemployment rates in the state. And companies like Viva use that to their benefit, because they come in, I'm simplifying it, but basically with the message of, don't worry about the environment, don't worry about the climate, jobs, 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 we're going to give you jobs. And it's a lie, because, you know, we know the jobs are minimal. We know these jobs are skilled jobs, and they're not going to go to the vast majority of people in the suburbs where I live that are unemployed, but people are sucked into it out of desperation. So yeah, I think, you know, in that sense, a UBI would be useful, because, you know, people wouldn't have that sense of desperation of, you know, I need to support a gas terminal or an oil refinery or whatever it is, because they're telling me that there's jobs in it for me. That's it.
Okay, perhaps we can take the wheel from one more panelist. So Melisa, would you like to answer this question about UBI, and in terms of perhaps how it will be implemented in your country?
Yeah, so some people are actually discussing this UBI because I guess in Indonesia, a lot of the jobs that are extractive and whatnot are people that are trying to make ends meet, right? So there's a lot of farmers who are forced by condition to enter, be part of the palm oil industry, for example, because again, like they need to meet ends meet. But I personally are not so excited about the concept of UBI because it will give more legitimacy for the government to actually grow the investments further the same way they're doing it now, so that they can have more tax money to provide for these UBIs. So it becomes like a self-fulfillment system and cycle. And again, I think with things like UBI, it's very difficult, as we can see in a lot of the climate and a lot of the financial crisis. Things that get cut first are the money that goes to help the communities and whatnot. So there's also always a potential where the UBI is stopped. So it really should be like, what do these people need the UBI for, right? Is it fulfillment of basic needs? Then perhaps we should just go for that and provide these non-monetary UBIs through infrastructure of, say, like energy, decentralized food system, decentralized water filters, just things that allows them to get that UBI without the money itself and permanently, as opposed to they have to be dependent on the UBI. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Melisa. So this panel discussion is coming to an end. So before we end this discussion, I would like to give each panelist a few minutes to give their final comments and also give a brief wrap up. So perhaps Lydie can go first.
I was just thinking of what to say as final comments. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here, and very glad to be with all of you, to be with people who are fellow travelers along the same journey and towards the same end. I hope we will be able to meet each other again in the front battles and in various discussions. If there's other people who want to be more apprised about what's going on in climate and energy fights, please feel free to get in touch with all of us here in the panel. And thank you to my fellow speakers. I've also learned a lot from you and looking forward. And just to say, this is the power of women as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, you can go next.
Thank you. Yes, I didn't have anything prepared for closing comments either, but so I guess just to echo Lydie, I've definitely learned a lot from both speakers. So thank you, and thanks for inviting me to speak. You know, I think when I first got involved in socialism, and socialist politics and activism, my understanding quickly became that, you know, the role of us as socialists in the various movements is to connect the dots for people, to connect this issue to that issue, and to connect it to the system and explain it to people. And I think, you know, it's not to say that any other social justice issue, worker struggle, is not important, but I think it's increasingly important that the climate struggle is the struggle. Like everything else really is secondary to, are we going to have a livable planet in 5 to 10 years time? So increasingly for us as socialists or eco-socialists, however you describe yourself, it's bringing in all these movements and drawing the links to how does it come back to climate? How is the refugee rights struggle connected to climate? How is the workers' rights struggle connected to climate? And connected back to the system and socialism. So, you know, that's the challenge for all of us ahead. I certainly hope we can have more events like this and more international solidarity between the groups. But thank you, Lydie and Melisa, and thanks to the organisers of the conference.
Thank you. Melisa, you can go next.
Again, thank you so much for having this even. This is really great event, and I learned so much from the speakers and even the questions. Sorry, there's a baby crying in the background. But yeah, I guess I'm personally relatively new in this activism, and I feel that with the climate crisis, as sad as it is a tragedy, but it does bring us the awareness of what a messed up system we live in, and I think that calls for some hope that we are going towards a better future. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So it's really important that we do provide full solidarity of all fights, all injustice, because we are all fighting the same fight. And when we achieve the justice, world peace is attainable. So keep fighting, everyone. Thank you so much for being in this fight. I'm looking forward to learning so much more from everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Melisa. So our panel discussion ends here. Once again, thank you to all the panelists, Lidi, Sarah, Melisa, for taking time out to speak with us today. And also a huge thank you to all the participants that joined this session, and I hope you all enjoyed the talk. Our next session, Colonialism in the 21st Century and the Struggles for Self-Determination, will be happening in an hour from now. So do join us for the next session. Goodbye and thank you, everyone.